Greetings, everyone. This is Doravel. You probably know me. I send out a lot of information to people, books, things of that nature, trying to get us to increase our readership. I think it's very important. There's one book in particular, How Racism Has Changed the Human Brain, Neuroplasticity, and Chronic Stress of Everyday Racism in Contemporary America. And this is by Joseph R. Gibson. This author is very prolific. He has many books on Amazon. I think he has about 30 or 40 books on Amazon and various subject titles. He's very diverse in his offerings. I do suggest many of his books. They're uh, very informative. This one book in particular is one that I've been suggesting to many, and I think it's very important. I wish other people would have taken the initiative. I was asking them to read it, but since they're not taking the initiative, I'm going to go ahead and take the initiative and start to go through this book on YouTube because I just think it's important for us to understand how the brain works. And in understanding how the brain works, hopefully that can help us make better choices, better decision making, to let us understand how we may act, and we can properly interrupt bad acts before before they get us in trouble. But I had already did over an hour of this, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time because I've been trying to figure out how to use this particular medium. I never did this before, so this is my first time, and I'm just going to go at it. Once it is recognized that racial oppression is inherent in the nature of the social order, it becomes clear that the real racial drama is not simply racism, but the fact that racism is an everyday problem. This is a quote from Philomena Essed that's in the book. The behaviors that generate and sustain racial inequality in America, though historically conditioned, are not unconscious or unthinking. To the contrary, such behaviors are very much intentional conduct insofar as they are representative of a wholesale acceptance of stereotypes and of conscious indifference to structural disparity that ensues. This is a quote by Christopher A. Bracey. And this is one by Carter G. Woodson coming up here. Everyone should know this one. It's a very well-known one. If you can control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions. When you determine what a man shall think, you don't have to concern yourself about what he will do. If you make a man feel that he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it himself. If you make a man think that he is justly an outcast, you don't have to order him to the back door. He will go without being told. And if there's no back door, his very nature will demand one. Carter G. Woodson, as I said. Excuse me. I'm going to go forward here in the book a little bit. Page 1. When a spell is put on you, an introduction to survival-oriented human brain and how chronic stress changes it. Sometimes at deep unconscious levels, People do not really wish to find answers to problems that they obsessively complain about, even when that problem has caused the death of millions of people. There is the conscious awareness, perhaps, of the need to know the truth and to understand in depth. But below this surface, there is the more powerful need to maintain the status quo, which depth knowledge and awareness would now, when depth knowledge and awareness would explode in volcanic fashion. However, I have no such unconscious need. To the exact contrary, I perceive the existing chaos and injustice, on the planet Earth to be of such horrendous magnitude that the global evil needs to be broken asunder by the surfacing of depth, knowledge, and insight, so that the true calm of a greater justice can evolve and prevail. It is just as when a volcano spews forth the molten materials from its core. The soil upon which the ash falls becomes enriched and more fertile, from which subsequently springs forth. That's a quote by Francis Cress Welsing. A little dry here. Excuse me. I have written a lot of books, obviously or indirectly, about racism. Far more than I ever intended to. Honestly, I'm a little tired of the topic. Throughout this journey as a researcher and author, my understanding of racism has evolved from classically dogmatic to, well, what you're beginning to read now. It's at most as if each new book made its predecessor slightly obsolete. Every book I've ever written pursued the same goal and had the same origin story. The goal was to answer this beautiful, vexatious question: what do I see around or in me that's just messed up, that I'd like to understand more? Then I check Amazon.com or Barnes and Nobles to find out if a book responding to my answer in a way I felt content with already existed. If not, I wrote it. Writing this one in particular was a struggle that sincerely tested my evolving understanding of what it meant to practice mindfulness. It took me longer to complete this project than any other in my career for a variety of reasons, most of which was simply doubt in the validity of my bizarre premise, let alone having to learn general neuroscience and the basics of neuroplasticity before completely forming said premise. This book was written to convince myself, and then hopefully you, of a tricky theory that one day just popped in my mind. I soon became convinced that compellingly proving this unprecedented premise was important enough to evolve the existing literature on contemporary racism in America. So I wrote How Racism Has Changed the Human Brain. Eric Garland and Matthew Howard inevitably realized that, quote, psychosocial forces shape neurobiology, unquote. Psychosocial forces. Okay. So he's talking about your brain is being conditioned by the social circumstances that you find yourself in. As its title suggests, this book looks at how specific psychosocial forces like racism, or more specifically, the chronic stress of everyday racism and presumed Black inferiority, changes the brain structure and functioning in an enduring way of both Black and white Americans. Now, what I really like about this author, he's heavily researched. Everything is heavily researched. Very many footnotes and quotes from current materials. Richard Davidson and Bruce McEwen identified that, quote, the brain is constantly being shaped wittingly and unwittingly by environmental forces that impinge upon organisms. Among the influences on the brain structure and functions that are most powerful in inducing plastic change are social influences. And basically what he's saying, you basically learn by observation. We mimic those who we're around. We actually copy off of others. So this is how people learn. This is nothing new. It's called mimetics, mimicry. That's how we learn. One of the most consistent, ubiquitous social influences available in America is racism. Thus, it's only logical to conclude that racism is one of, if not the most powerful influence on changes of the brain structure and function, i.e., neuroplasticity of Americans. While this book examines the neuroplastic impact of various versions of American racism, our foremost focus is on what Philomena Essed dubbed, quote, everyday racism, unquote. Everyday racism, a concept I never had even heard of until I needed to find out about it, is extremely multifaceted yet surprisingly under-acknowledged. Everyday racism is concurrently interpersonal, intergroup, institutionalized, structural, emotional, experiential, cognitive, unconscious, or implicit, deliberate, aversive, tangible, perceptual, cultural, cumulative, and internalized. Moreover, it most accurately describes what racism and its intrinsic presumptions of Black inferiority or delusion of white superiority looks like in the 21st century America. According to Essed, everyday racism incorporates the racial attitudes and actions, oftentimes unremarkably permeating daily life in American society. Everyday racism is the integration of racism into everyday situations through the practice, cognitive and behavioral, that activate underlying power relations. Read that again. Everyday racism is the integration of racism into everyday situations through practices, cognitive and behavioral, that activate underlying power relations. So you have people that are passive and active, basically. Okay. You got someone who passively does stuff racist, as I don't use white supremacy anymore. I just use white terrorism because that's what it is. So white terrorism, they are either passively, where they do stuff unconsciously, or they're active, or they're actually doing things to keep the racism moving right along as it has been for the past 500 plus years. Or you want to, actually, I think we give it a pass. I think we need to start including the trans-Sahara slave, the trans-Sahara prisoner of wars as well. So that we're talking about well over 1,200 years of just horrible conditions that we've been treated by other people. So I think we need to update our thought process in those areas, because I think that's needed. Going to start over on that line again. I think I was on this line here. Everyday racism is more so a systemic, not there, but I'm going to start. Everyday racism is the integration of racism into everyday situations through practices, cognitive and behavioral, that activate underlying power relations. That's where I left off. Next sentence. Everyday racism is more so a systemic than individual-based process involving the continuous, often unconscious exercise of power predicated in taking for granted the privileging of whiteness. Non-white Americans are subtly victimized, mostly by systematic, recurrent, and familiar practices, rather than extreme incidents. Need to read that again. This is why I say this book is so well researched, and everything is on point. Non-white Americans are subtly victimized, mostly by systematic, recurrent, and familiar practices. So people aren't dumb about what they're doing when they do stuff to you that's harmful, that's stressful, because stress is harmful. That's stress is terrorism. Okay, but that's what we have to get into our vocabulary to realize that stress is terror. Okay, because it brings about biological in your physical body, problems with your health. Non-white Americans are subtly victimized, mostly by systematic, recurrent, and familiar practices rather than extreme incidents. However, everyday racism doesn't totally exclude or excuse individual racism, like unconscious racism or implicit bias arguments attempt to. White Americans still demonstrate a significant degree of individual or interpersonal racism, which, to quote James M. Jones, suggests a persistent, quote, belief in the superiority of one's own race over another and in the behavioral enactments that maintain those superior and inferior positions, unquote. Now, see, this is something that we must realize as well. Even though you had a lot of the Northern abolitionists that were against slavery, they still thought that people classified as Black, I use brilliant because the real meaning of the word BLAC means brilliant. Okay? They changed the spelling BLACK and changed the definition. The original definition, when you go and look up the definition of Black, was BLAC, meaning brilliant, shiny. So we have to upgrade our thinking to a large degree and get away from these false definitions that they've now given us. So these people have come to believe that they're superior. And James M. Jones, which I'll repeat, belief in the superiority of one's own race over another and in the behavioral enactments that maintain those superior and inferior positions. And as I was saying before about the abolitionists, if they think that you were still inferior, even though you weren't enslaved, you're still taking away my being. You're still taking away me being a fully free being, making my own choices, controlling my own good. And this is another word that we have to be careful of, because good is not a moral meaning. Good is a product. You go to the store and buy goods. They have totally messed with the definition there as well. So we take on the word good to mean moral, and it doesn't mean moral. It means product. It means sustenance. That's why the word God comes from good, because God gives you sustenance. He's, nature gives you sustenance. It's not good or bad. It gives everybody. It gives the same to everybody. So good is not a moral condition. Good is a product. And we should not use that word, especially when we're talking about people who classify themselves as white. They are never good. What they did is change it to have a moral meaning. And because we then therefore have to get sustenance from them, they become our God. Because we don't make anything. We don't even make the toilet paper we use, the toothpaste we use. We have to go and spend our money in their establishments to get what we need, because we don't have any manufacturing base. Okay. Michael Adams realized that racism is demonstrably preposterous. It is also remarkably tenacious, mostly because, as explained by James Lowen, the sneaking suspicion that African Americans might be inferior goes unchallenged in the hearts of many Black and white folks. Now, there's many studies that's going to get into it later, that talks about it. We have a serious issue of internalizing this inferiorization. We do, even though a lot of us may say it with our mouths but in the back and in this greater society, it's there. You can't get away from it, okay? Because they put it in the society, okay? So you can't get away from it. I believe that racism, specifically race-based experiences of tangible inequity and presumed Black inferiority, the psychological and physiological processes by which we inevitably internalize these experiences, as well as chronic everyday racism related stress, changes the human brain. Not only do I believe this, but my and others' research invariably demonstrate that racism is just not some theoretical concept, but a critical, a current component of the lived experience of Black and white Americans in today's society. And that it has real effects on these people's brains, both black and white. Believe it or not, this is not merely an accusatory book against white people. I am far more concerned with how chronic everyday related racism, stress, and the accompanying neuroplasticity somehow causes racial inequality and presumed Black inferiority to become reflexively self-reinforcing. In other words, it appears that beliefs such as Black people are inferior becomes inevitably hardwired in the typical American's brains, which makes us all vulnerable to acting unconsciously in ways that confirm those beliefs. He didn't say some, he said all. So, as I said, even though you have people who succeed at a high success rate, that means they're dealing with the stress or the racism to make great accomplishments. That doesn't mean that it didn't affect them negatively. They just became great overachievers. And that is also a psychological issue. Because you're either gonna fail up or you're gonna fail down. That's just how it is. You either fail up or you fail down. But you're still being affected by the force of the system, which is white terrorism. In other words, it appears that beliefs such as Black people are inferior becomes inevitably hardwired in the typical American's brain, which makes us all vulnerable to acting unconsciously in ways that confirm those beliefs. As an African American urban educator, it appalls me to witness firsthand, generation after generation of Black people becoming more and more convinced that we are not as humanely valuable as white people, and then act upon this conviction day by day. I am both terrified and increasingly alienated by the apparent accuracy of Nam Akbar's assertion that once you begin to believe that you are not as good as other people, your actions follow your mind. You automatically assume that you are inferior. You begin to believe that you have less human potential. The stage is now set for the cycle of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You believe they are superior and that you are inferior. And sure enough, you start acting inferior. The human brain has a tendency to create internal representations of the external circumstances of our lives, transforming perceived external information into patterned neuronal activity. Our brains most efficient in terms of surviving racism or sustaining privilege. Response to presumed Black inferiority has become to internalize it, i.e., transform this belief into patterned neuronal activity. Patterned neuronal activity, as we'll explore soon, changes the neural structure and functioning of the brain. Pattern neuronal activity also practically controls our thinking, which is not good if you accept Carter G. Woodson's contention that if you can control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions. When you determine what a man shall think, you don't have to concern yourself about what he will do. If you can make a man feel he is inferior, you don't have to compel him to an inferior status, for he will seek it himself. You do not have to tell him not to stand here or go yonder. He will find his proper place, and he will stay in it. You do not have to order him to the back door. He will go without being told. And if there is no back door, his very nature will demand one. One more specifically, neuroplasticity will demand one. Excuse me, or more specifically, neuroplasticity will demand one. That's the author's adding his 2 cents to the quote. The more I studied, the more obvious it became. How could no one have written about this yet? So in a nutshell, this book seeks a neuroplasticity-based understanding of the human response to everyday racism, i.e., presumed Black inferiority and the accompanying chronic racism-related stress. But what does that mean exactly? How does that literally happen? Well, it's kind of complicated, but here goes. The past and present thoughts, observations, feelings, actions, and overreactions of every human being on the planet are all results of neural activity occurring in our brain. Read that again. Read that again. The past and present thoughts, observations, feelings, actions, and overreactions of every human being on this planet are all results of neural activity occurring in our brain, consisting of billions of connected neurons or nerves, cells, via neural pathways and neural structures. The human brain is a remarkably complicated entity capable of profound consistency as well as tremendous change. Our brains are constantly changing and adapting to circumstances of our lives, especially those that prove to be consistent or chronic. Our thoughts, observations, emotions, actions, and overreactions with regard to these circumstances deeply influence this change process known as neuroplasticity. And those things that are most persistently thought of, observed, felt, acted, and overreacted to create the strongest neural pathways and most altered neural structures. The human brain is principally designed to support human survival by ensuring that we as human make danger a priority. Need to repeat that. The human brain is principally designed to support human survival by ensuring that we as humans make danger a priority. Rudolf Gergerich alleged that, quote, the human brain's most important task is to keep the individual alive, unquote. So your brain is going to keep you alive. That's its highest priority, to keep you living. So you'll get into all types of maladjusted behaviors because of stress, because of white terrorism. And because you're thinking, because they already know this, science has proven this, the stress in your amygdala, that hampers your ability to think, to use your reasoning because of the stress, because your brain goes into a survival mode. So you can't think when you're trying to survive. Your thinking is your reasoning is hampered. That deserves a reread. The human brain is principally designed to support human survival by ensuring that we as humans make danger a priority. Rudolf Gergerich alleged that the human brain's, quote, the human brain's most important task is to keep the individual alive, unquote. The brain, described David Amadeo, is a, quote, survival machine, unquote. It was created to feel, perceive, process, retain, and react to information from our circumstances for one preeminent purpose: physical and psychological survival. In other words, the human brain is survival oriented. So you have a survival machine that's survival oriented, that seeks all avenues to survive. Stress, more specifically, the stress response, is our brain's most efficient survival mechanism. Stress, or the stress response, is our brain's overreaction to any information from our circumstances that imply threat. The stress response is also referred to as the fight or flight response because it effectively prepares the human body to either fight or flee from this implied threat. The human brain, when faced with a real or imagined threat to human survival, readies the human being to confront the threat or promptly get as far away, physically or psychologically, from the threat as possible. This fight or flight response, first coined by American psychologist Walter Cannon in 1920s, instinctively enables surviving any perceived threatening circumstances or stressors to become the brain's undisputed priority. A byproduct of millennia of human evolution, the stress response employs various neural pathways and structures to hastily maximize our chance of survival when perception coupled with prior experience imply peril. It is arguably the most ancient and automatic neural activity performed by the human brain. Once confronted with the possibility of demise, our brain has become hardwired to automatically activate the stress response. Throughout our evolution, survival typically required a sudden reaction to a threatening situation. Even slight moments of mental hesitation or inefficiency could easily result in mortality. Consequently, as succeeding generations of humanity successfully negotiated threats to their survival, the human brain began to change based on the repetition of certain neural trends that facilitated continued existence. This change yielded the fight or flight response to a reflexive reaction by the human brain to rapidly provide the body with those resources, e.g., increases in the increases in the release of certain hormones and neurotransmitters to enhance physical functioning, required for either resisting or running from a threat. Whether this threat is psychological or physical, the brain and the body responses to threat occur, and because they have become reflexive or hardwired due to past utility, the responses typically supersede critical thought or active choice for the sake of rapidity and ensured survival. Although stress, i.e., the stress response, is not technically an emotion, it is discernibly emotional. That again, although stress, i.e., stress response, is not technically an emotion, it is discernibly emotional. Arguably, humanity's most persistent and neuroplasticities inducing emotional response. Fundamental to the success of the fight or flight response is the actual emotion of fear, or more specifically, anxiety. Read that again. Fundamental to the success of the fight or flight response is the actual emotion of fear, or more specifically, anxiety. Without fear and anxiety, stress and the stress response could not logically exist. If as humans we couldn't be afraid or perceivable threats, we wouldn't survive for very long. In terms of natural selection, appropriately scared people survived, and their successors inherited this selectively advantageous brain-based capacity for fright. Although it's often criticized as handicapping, the definitive function of fear and anxiety is to sustain survival. While all emotions serve some discernible purpose, our more primal emotions like fear evolve to maximize our natural goal of self-preservation by providing a reflexive motivation to fight or flee, or sometimes freeze in order to become a less visible target. Now that part kind of is funny because you see that in a lot of the horror movies where people will freeze, can't move, too scared to move. That's interesting. As aforementioned, the human brain is survival oriented. This survival orientation is the consequence of human experience and selective structural and functional brain changes that prove advantageous to that experience. The human brain is not at all static. It continually adapts and adjusts to pattern repetitive thoughts, emotions, observations, actions, overreactions, and experiences. James Zoll wrote that the brain is molded and reshaped by the forces of life acting on it. Read that again. James Zoll wrote that the brain is molded and reshaped by the forces of life acting on it. Our wiring grows and develops depending on what we experience. Directly or indirectly and vicariously. As a result of neuroplasticity, recurring thoughts, emotion, observations, actions, overreactions, and experiences effectively become neural structure. The human brain is literally formed and reformed under the influence of external and internal stimuli of neural pathways, functions, and structures. Consider your brain as a vast series of continually forming circuits or wires. Each circuit is a chain of aroused neurons. Neurons are primary cells of the brain. The other type of brain cells are glial cells, which exist only to maintain neurons, each enclosed by branches or dendrites that send and receive electrochemical signals, i.e., information, from other neurons. Each neural circuit distinctively affects our cognitive, emotional, or behavioral response to the circumstances of our lives. These circuits are created by our experiences, especially those experiences associated with stress. In fact, most of our neural circuits are formed either throughout our first 3 years of life or when we experience chronic stress. Now, this is very interesting because we go to the Nellie Fuller and Frances Cress Welsing. They talk about how men and women are forever children. Our people are forever children. And we see here that it said the neural circuits are formed in the first 3 years. So being that the white terrorism always keeps us in a childlike state, and we're experiencing this chronic stress, that's why we're like children. Because we're stuck in a state of a child as far as neurologically from the stress. Experience changes our brains by activating or overacting certain neurons or certain neurons or neural structures, as well as alter a neural circuitry. When we constantly or intensely experience something, the neurons in our brain associated with our actions or reactions to that experience fire, i.e., are activated repeatedly. When neurons fire repeatedly, they grow, or more specifically, their dendrites grow and extend themselves towards each other, neurons, eventually forming neural connections or circuitry via the connecting neurons, synapses. The new neural circuitry sends electrochemical signals back and forth over billions of connected neurons within specific areas or structures in the brain. Neural circuitry processes information and mediates human behavior. We read that because that's important. Neural circuitry processes information and mediates human behavior. Emotions are equally as influential as experiences in the altering of neural circuitry. The brain experiences emotions via the release of certain neurotransmitters or brain chemicals like adrenaline and dopamine, as well as hormones such as cortisol. When neural structures and pathways are chronically awash with these brain chemicals and hormones, neural structures and pathways can be significantly changed structurally or functionally. We call all this neuroplasticity, the ability of neural structures and pathways to change in response to a stressful or chronic experience or emotion. Neuroplasticity, Rudolf Gergreck recognized, is a, quote, precondition for any persistent behavioral change, behavioral cognition, and emotion, unquote. Read that again. Quote, precondition for any persistent behavioral change, behavioral cognition, and emotion. Neuroplasticity is possible because of the capacity of neurons to extend and create connections between brain regions and structures in order to facilitate efficient recall of past experiences and emotions, along with reflexive instigations of a response. Neuroplasticity is necessary for survival-oriented human brain. As a matter of fact, our brain changes the most and the most permanently with regard to efficiently promoting our survival. Ooh, ears. Kind of been a long day. Oh, we've been an hour here. We're on page 9 so far. This is a long book. I think it's 500 pages, but it's worth reading. Definitely worth reading. I'm going to read that last paragraph again. Neuroplasticity is necessary for the survival-oriented human brain. As a matter of fact, our brain changes the most and the most permanently with regard to efficiently promoting our survival. Most of our neural circuitry is formed or changed to provide an advantageous response to potentially life-threatening or stressful circumstances. Neural circuitry deemed disadvantageous for survival are weakened into negligence or never developed. Basically, what he's saying there is that, stuff that is not used in your brain, your brain doesn't consider it a priority and will tend to forget to use it. So let's say you grew up as a child, you you could sew very well. Then you stopped sewing for like 30, 40 years. There's things about it you'd forget because you just didn't keep that skill up. So that's what he's basically saying is that, once you don't continue, or your brain, has information, because your brain can only store so much information. So those things that your brain does not feel that it needs to use its space to continue to hold, it will get rid of it because your brain only can hold so much information. So we're on page 9, and I think we're going to stop right there. If you find this information useful and helpful, please, by all means, Joseph R. Gibson is the author. I do suggest his work. We'll try to get back tomorrow. Don't really have a scheduled time in my head, but we'll continue to push through. I've already read most of the book myself, but I do think, like I said, it's beneficial. I think it's good for everyone to know the information. Hopefully that it can help. I think it's definitely, for the most part, can help many of our people to upgrade their thinking. Because once you know something, you can usually combat it a little better. So I do thank you for this time that you spent with me on this live stream. Doravel, if you would like to contact me, please leave information in the description, or you can just contact me, doravel@gmail.com. I do have a lot of resources that I do freely share. I believe information should be free. I do agree that we should share information. And I do thank you for your time. And we're out. Till next time.